Have you ever thought of buying a franchise or currently own one or many? If so, this podcast is for you. Welcome to Franchise Euphoria, the podcast created and hosted by franchise attorney Josh Brown for the sole purpose of helping people find success through franchising.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Franchise Euphoria, the podcast to help buyers, owners, and expansion-minded businesses find success through franchising. I am thrilled to have on the show today Joel Goobich. Joel is a big picture guy with sharp insight into how individual parts make a strong whole. He's tireless in pursuit of solutions to boost your business, adapt to the changing business environment, and ultimately put you on track to a profitable transition and exit to your next act. Joel's drive to solve problems and create positive change is evident from his background, beginning with service in the Israeli army and 2 advanced degrees in applied chemistry. His technical background, product development, and innovation skills resulted in multiple patents and numerous trademarks. He's been in your shoes as an entrepreneur, business buyer, and business owner. He founded Colorations Inc., which he built from the start to a leading international manufacturer and distributor of children's art products. Using the firsthand knowledge gained from a rewarding and well-planned and implemented exit from the company, he now focuses his considerable intensity on working with business owners to strengthen the elements of their businesses into a dynamic whole that leads to a successful and satisfying exit through his consulting and marketing firms, Big Picture Advisors, LLC, and I3 Marketing, LLC. And last but not least, he is also a podcaster himself. He's got 2 tremendous podcasts, one of which is called Don't Get Stuck in Your Business, and the second is Build Business Muscle, and I'm sure we will get into all of that. So hello, Joel, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Josh.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. We've had an opportunity to talk off the air, and I just find your background and experience fascinating. And, you know, my audience is made up of franchise buyers, owners, and those small business owners that really want to grow through the franchise model. And you have considerable experience in helping businesses grow the right way and exit the right way. I mean, you started and built from scratch a company that would become an international success, and eventually you went public with it. I'd love to begin by just having you take us back to those early days when success wasn't guaranteed. How did you come up, first of all, with the idea for Coloration, and then how did you first begin in setting up the business?
Well, those are great questions, and it takes me back a couple years. At the time, when I started Colorations, I really had no idea of what my next play was going to be. I just knew that the company that I was working for was not where I wanted to be. And I started to develop, well, the story actually comes from the fact that I went to my daughter's kindergarten open house for the first time, and what I saw were what I call pin the tail on the turkey type of art. It was just before Thanksgiving, and I had then gone to a job interview at a company that was making liquid car waxes. And I go through the process and see the interview, and we saw the production line. And I asked the person at the end who was giving me the tour, well, I see you're filling a lot of bottles with water. Are you making any money? And he said, it's 99% water and a little bit of colorant. You tell me, are we making money? And on the drive home, I said, wow, colored water, added value water. Isn't that what's missing from my daughter's artwork? There was no color. There was nothing there. And I came home and went immediately to my source book of formulations that I had collected over time. As a chemist by trade, I always collected different things in the event that I might need it. And I said, well, paints are added value water. So I found a formulation for cold cream because I figured finger paints have to feel good and they have to smell good also. And most paints at the time, kids' paints, they didn't. So I got the free formulation to how to make cold cream. I added some non-toxic pigments, mixed it up, and told my 5-year-old daughter and my 3-year-old daughter at the time to bring their kids over on the weekend. We're going to lay out pieces of paper on the kitchen table and go at it and let me see what's going on. And that was the start of colorations. Now, at the time, I was still looking for a job, but I saw the enthusiasm of my kids and all the neighbors' kids, and I said, wow, there might be something there. At the same time, I also had read in the newspaper, and this is something that your audience should pay attention to. There is so much information to be gleaned from reading things and sort of filing them away, because things are not always the direct information that you're looking for. Sometimes it's off on the side. I had no thoughts at the time of starting a business, but I had read in the paper that the Head Start program was going to be funded to the tune of like $3 billion. And it was a half-a-day program for 700,000 children. Well, I did the math. And I said, half-a-day program for half a year for 700,000 kids divided by $2.8 billion, that's like $30,000 a kid. There's got to be some percentage of that that's just for art materials. Man, there is a big marketplace there. And that was the genesis. That was the seed for saying, well, I'm going to take this cold cream formulation with a little pigment that I put into it and see if I could get this into the preschools.
Well, I mean, that's just incredible. I mean, only could that happen to somebody who's a chemist and an entrepreneur, right? I mean, to be able, I would have just never, ever thought about that. I mean, that's what's so, to me, is so incredible about it. So you come up with this creation and you try it out in your kids' neighborhood and everybody seems to like it. Then how did you go and actually set up your business? How did you go into your due diligence first to make sure that the product wasn't already out there? Or if it was that you were going to differentiate yourself sufficiently enough, and then beyond that, go and set up the business?
Also, fantastic questions, because I think I had the germ of being an entrepreneur in me, but I never let it out. And I had the advantage that I was working in a company that was located next to one of the first business incubators / accelerators in the Northeast area. I was living in Cleveland at the time. So I sort of took half an hour out of my day and slinked out of the office or the lab that I was working in and went upstairs to this location. And I knocked on their door and I said, is there anybody here that might be able to help me with this idea? And it's a good thing, it's a good lesson to always sort of test out your idea with somebody else, because our ideas, in my mind, for example, I have tons of great business ideas, but sometimes it's really important to get the feedback from somebody else. And a lot of times that feedback, most times it's going to be negative and say, you got to be crazy. You got, there's nothing there. You've got to listen to your gut, obviously, but by going to somebody else, they put me on the path to say, here are some things that you should be thinking about. So I took that information from the Head Start that it was $2.8 billion and all that, and I started looking at what the competition was. It was Crayola and Rose Art. There was very little art materials coming in from China. Actually, nothing was coming in from China at the time. And I looked at what they had, what they were paying for it, how they were packaging it, how I could differentiate myself. And I determined that I was going to differentiate myself by making the first paint. I was never able to get a patent on this, unfortunately, but I was able to trademark the concept and the packaging, where instead of having a separate paint for finger painting and a separate paint for tempera painting that is with a brush and a separate one for using sponges, which are the three main ways that children paint, I made a formulation that was all in one. So I called it 3-in-1, similar to 3-in-1 oil. And that was a differentiator. And then I went and looked for packaging that would be able to essentially tell that story as well. I spent a lot of time thinking about the packaging. So I sat down, I wrote my business plan. At the time, business plans were 7-year business plans. I don't think people do 7-year business plans. I certainly don't recommend 7-year business plans nowadays. But at that time, that was the standard. And I looked at the different marketplaces, and there were two main market areas. And the United States is different in terms of children's art materials than any other place in the world. Because here, the school systems buy art materials and then give them to the kids to use. Whereas in Europe or other places, the parents buy the art materials and have the kids bring them to the schools. So what that meant was that here in the United States, art materials are sold in bulk quantities, which make the profit margin a lot higher because you're buying, without going into all the intricacies of cost analysis of how you sell art materials, it just was a much better business model than selling directly to a parent. At the time, I was also at just the cusp of a marketplace that was starting to consolidate. And that is another key. That is, if you are in marketplaces don't like to expand forever. At some point, they're going to consolidate. There's only so much growth and so many market opportunities that a certain market segment can take. So in the educational supply market, it had already gotten to that overexpansion. And so if you come in and you do business with the ones that are gobbling up the other ones, then you're in an advantage. And that was part of my business plan as well.
Well, that's fascinating because so basically you saw from the beginning, you thought about from the beginning sort of your exit strategy, and you knew you were in a market with a big player like Crayola and the others, and it sounds like you were taking the time to figure out, okay, how am I going to be different? How am I going to approach this differently? I mean, was it at that point where you realized, I mean, you knew you had a good idea, right? Because you had your kids that said, oh, we love this, and the neighborhood kids and so on and so forth. But, I think an important point to drive home is that there's a difference between a good or great idea and a good or great business. And getting from that good or great idea into a good or great business can be a challenge. I mean, when did you first realize in that business that, man, I've got something really, really great here?
You're right. That is a good point. There is a difference between people get confused between a good product or a good service and a good business. And oftentimes what's the difference between a success and not success in business is having the right business model. My business model at the time was somewhat constrained because there was no internet. And so the only way that I could go to market was to either manufacture myself or have somebody manufacture and package. And then I would inventory and sell it to distributors who would then sell it to the public. So I was tied into the particular business model at that time. It happened to work for me, and like I mentioned before, it worked for me because I realized that the marketplace was contracting through consolidation. And so I realized that I had a good business and a good business model when I went to my first major trade show. It happened to be in Las Vegas in 1972. And I was mobbed. I was not prepared for how many people were coming to my booth. I just had no idea. But the real kicker was when Crayola and Rose Art, the two big competitors, came slinking by my booth trying to sneak my price list and brochure. So I saw them at the corner of my eye, and I said, hey, come on in. I have no secrets whatsoever. Here's my price list. Take a sample, because I've got yours. And they looked at me and said, what? How is it that you have our price list and all that? I said, well, That's my business. You're competing with me. Of course I've got all your information. That's when I knew that I had something. When the major competition that was doing, and Crayola at the time was doing $300 million a year, when they were so interested in my price list and my brochures that they would spend the time to try to sneak and get it.
What prevented them, though, at that time from just copying you and essentially crushing your business? I mean, was there some intellectual property attached to what you were doing?
Well, there was to some degree, because I had taken trademarks out and I had some patent pending formulation work, but that's really not the reason, because big companies aren't as worried about that. There's nowadays even more protections that small businesses have to their advantage, but it's a simple calculation for a company like Crayola to change everything, to recognize as this little upstart that at the time I had $15,000, $20,000 in sales, that they were going to spend $50,000 to $250,000 to compete with me, to actually go and take the time to do new formulation work, to do new packaging, new marketing, and whatever. That's a real serious investment for a company to do before your competitor really has shown up on the map.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think, you hear a lot. You hear people who are worried about that, but I think that that's a really, really great point, is that here you are, and to them, while they're intrigued, and obviously you knew from them coming over to your booth, you're just really small compared to them at that time. So they're not necessarily worried about it. But then when you start building it up and they start noticing even more, at that point, it becomes sort of an analysis of, okay, do we try to buy this person, or do we try to see how we can do that? Do we even want to get into that market? I mean, it's so obvious from your experience in doing that. You know how to get started the right way. Like everything you spoke of speaks to the type of due diligence that you have to do, and the kind of business sense that people really need to have to be successful in the early stages of their business. But I'm curious too, for somebody who is out there who just bought their first franchise, so they're buying essentially somebody else's business model and trying to implement it, and they're about to open their doors. What kind of advice do you have to help them get started the right way? And some people might be confused by that question and say, well, they're already buying a proven business model. But you and I both know that just because you've got the model doesn't mean you're going to be successful.
Well, that's true. That's like buying a cookbook and saying, I'm going to be a top chef.
That's right.
If it was that simple, then we would all be top chefs. A franchise owner, somebody who buys a franchise or a number of franchises, has a major advantage over somebody else. They've sort of leapfrogged the game to some degree because they have processes that have fortunately over time been refined and proven to work. That's that cookbook. What the cookbook does not give them, and nobody's going to give them except themselves, are two things that I talked about actually in a recent podcast on Build Business Muscle, and that is passion and belief in yourself. People should not discount the concept of self-confidence, passion, and belief, and going out there and just doing it. That perhaps is one of the things that retards the success of new franchise owners, is that going out there and just doing it. I'll give you an example. A number of years ago when I started Big Picture Advisors, which was my latest consultancy group, it was a local business. I just wanted to do business locally. All my other businesses had been global, and I spent a lot of time eating peanuts on an airplane and probably seen every movie ever made. So I didn't really know anybody in the local business community. I vowed to meet and talk to 1,000 people in 1 year. I called it my 1,000-person campaign. And the reason I bring this up, because that new business owner, whether it's a franchise owner or any other, you have got to get out there. You have got to move the dial yourself. It's not enough to make a nice, beautiful store or a beautiful website and then send a press release, we're open, and you sit there waiting for business. You got to be out there showing people how much you believe in it, exhibiting to people the value that you are putting in, that your product or service, and a lot of it, especially at the beginning, is going to be you. That's such an important thing that I think gets lost a lot of times.
Yeah, no, I mean, I speak about that a lot on this show and write about it as well. And I could not agree more in that, it's all about the local community around you in most instances, right? I mean, we're not talking about online businesses here. We're talking about brick and mortar for the most part, where the reality is you may have a brand, you may have name recognition, you may have the goodwill associated with that. But if you can't integrate yourself in the community, in and around, within a 5 to 10 mile radius, usually, of your actual franchise, you're going to have a real tough time succeeding. I mean, the competition is just so great.
That's true. And a lot of franchises, I'll take an example of a mailbox, etc., mail and more type of franchise. Those franchises have been successful over time because, number one, they really don't have to spell out to the customer what they're all about. A lot of businesses, that is perhaps the biggest challenge at the beginning. What are we? What are we doing? But those type of businesses, which tend to be in shopping areas or whatever, conveniently located, that's a business that is a personal one-to-one type of business. I have seen those businesses be super successful because the owners of that franchise have gone out of their way to really understand everybody that comes into their store. Now, I have seen the opposite. I've seen those that it's almost like going to a trade show, and anybody who has been to a trade show, and probably a lot of the franchise owners have gone to a franchise trade show and have walked up and down the aisles of the trade show floor and seen those booths where somebody's sitting on a chair and can't even be bothered to get up to explain their product. Here's a brochure, take it if you want. There's a lot of booths that people aren't even located in. Why would I stop there if you can't be bothered to do something about to try to promote your own product or service? And the same thing holds true with your local franchise location. Getting to know, it's really, I know it may sound naive and a little old-fashioned, but even on the internet, I think that people love to do business with people. The more that it is interpersonal, the more that you can cut through some of the requirements that we have of constraints on our time and things of that sort, but get to know who your customer is. People will pay a little bit extra for that. It is worth their time and the value to them to have somebody who understands their needs.
Well, and I even think that in this day and age where everything is digital, everything is on the internet, is electronic, and I mean, I have all the devices as I'm sure you do too. I think people appreciate the in-person communication, or at the end of the day, sales is all about, right, you're going to be successful if people know, like, and trust you. They're going to come to you most of the time, right? If you have a product that they need, and that hasn't changed at all. And that's where I think some people just think that the internet has done more to change that than it really has, because I just look at the internet, digital communications, electronics as just a way to meet more people. But all you're really doing is getting to know them, and maybe you get to know them through a Skype call, and eventually, you'll meet up with them. But the whole idea that, businesses, I completely agree with what you said. I mean, businesses to be successful, you got to get to know your customers. You have to do the little things. I'll give you a quick example, and this just happened to me, and I've been talking about it ever since. I use this company called Ruby Receptionist. Have you heard of them, Joel?
Ruby Reception?
Ruby Receptionist. They're a company out of Oregon, and they do one thing, and they do it extremely well, and that is they provide live, virtual, very cheerful and professional receptionists for businesses. So in other words, when somebody calls my phone, they get a Ruby receptionist who's very professional, knows my business, and answers the phone the same exact way every time. And you just get that nice, courteous service, and they can take messages or they can pass it on through. And it's just, I've been using them for about 9 months now. But the reason I mention them is because what I've been so impressed with, and this ties into what you were saying, is that they do all the little things right too. So they have an excellent service, and that's obviously number one. But my wife and we just recently she's gave birth to our second daughter. And I have no idea how the people at Ruby Receptionist knew, because I certainly didn't email them and let them know. I assumed they probably followed me on social media or something like that and found out. But all of a sudden in the mail, I got a package. And the package had a onesie, like welcome to the world. And it had 2 Starbucks gift cards, with one for me and one for my wife, with a nice handwritten note. And I just thought to myself, I'm so pleasantly surprised. And isn't that almost kind of sad that I'm pleasantly surprised, because nobody does that anymore. Nobody goes out of their way. And so if you do go out of your way, and that's what these franchises and local businesses need to start doing more of, it's right there for the taking. And after I got that, I went on to the social media platforms, I tweeted them, and I wrote a blog article on it, and they read it and contacted me and were real appreciative. But the whole idea is, on the one hand, it's just a great example of, that's a company that truly gets it. It's sort of a masterclass in customer service and appreciation. But on the other end, it's almost a sad commentary on the state of where we are, because you so rarely get handwritten cards. You so rarely get people who reach out to you unless they have something to gain on the flip side.
That's true. I am a big believer that the more I give away, the more I get back. And almost every business that I've gone into, I've looked for that little bit of, what can I give somebody without any expectation that I'm going to get anything back. I'll give you an example from colorations. When I first started, one of the little tricks that I learned, and this is something that any franchise owner should look to as well. Look beyond your franchise and look how somebody else might be doing something, and how can you incorporate that, obviously within the limitations of your franchise, into building your franchise. It's a way of growing it differently. So at the time, and even nowadays, I guess, in the magazines that are sold predominantly to women, like Red Book or Better Homes and Gardens or things like that, there would be these little flat packets of hand cream or something like that people could try out. So I found out how those things were manufactured, and I sent them a couple, like 10, 15 gallons of paint, and we made little packets of paint. I actually trademarked it, called Little Bit of Paint. And I would hand out these little packets of Little Bit of Paint to every place I went to, every trade show, every teacher that I saw. Here, try it out. And it got so popular that people asked me if they could start buying it. And we created an entire product line based on Little Bit of Paint and Little Bit of Glue and Little Bit of other things. But it came from the notion of, I'm going to give you my product. Try it out. I'm not hiding behind it. I don't even want you to buy it. Just try it.
That's fascinating. I mean, Bob Berg, I'd mentioned to you earlier, but he wrote a great book called The Go-Giver, and one of the main principles is instead of being a go-getter, you become a go-giver. And it's not from the perspective of you're just giving away everything, right? Because a business has to make money. But the idea is, as he explains in his book, is, your goal should be to give more in value than you ultimately receive in payment, because that's a great win-win situation where you can get a healthy payment or profit, but you also give away enough, you give enough value to the person who parted ways with their money that they feel like they got a tremendous bargain with the deal, or they got tremendous value from it. I think that's so true. I mean, I think that and your example is perfect on that. It's amazing, just doing that, it led to almost a whole nother business for you, or at least a product line, right?
It did. And then, of course, the copycats come, and I actually like that. this sounds a little weird because a lot of people are scared of if they come out with a new product or new packaging that somebody's going to copy them. And at some point, yeah, it is scary and you got to be cognizant of it. But for me, when I did that and then Crayola and the big guys started copying me, all that did was validate. It validated in the marketplace that this was the way that things should be. And I was there already one step ahead of them because I'm always thinking 1 to 2 years down the road. What's the next product? What's the next iteration? What's the next thing? So by the time they caught up with me, I was already 2 years down the road in terms of planning and processing and all the other things. But the minute that your competitor validates, your bigger competitor validates your product, service, or your idea, that's actually a good thing for you.
Well, it's a compliment, right? It should be flattering. I mean, because as you said, it validates what you're doing. And I truly believe at the end of the day, the cream rises to the top, as they say. So obviously the competition is, if you are in a good market, there's going to be competition, whether it's you start with competition, ultimately there will be competition. But if you focus on what you're doing and your strengths and your points of differentiation and your model, yet you understand what the competition is doing and you pay attention to those kinds of things, ultimately the better product's going to win overall, or the better service, or whatever the case may be. I think that goes across sort of every market, and I think it's I think it's just fascinating as we touch upon all these business principles that we can relate to a franchise or to a non-franchise business. But one of the things that I know you have a particular expertise in is dealing with those kind of emergency situations that can't necessarily be planned for in a business, but certainly arise whether or not you own a franchise or a non-franchise business. I mean, how can a business owner plan for something that they know will happen, but not know when or what form it'll happen in?
Great question, and it happens all the time, no matter what. Evidenced by what happens during the winter time, especially during this winter around the country, that a lot of municipalities and people and businesses aren't ready for the extra cold that we've been having.
Absolutely. I mean,
so for example, obviously there are weather issues and natural disasters that we can prepare for in a business, and we can do a lot of that, at least certainly make sure that we are insured properly for that. One of the type of insurances that a lot of people do not get, they may get insurance on their inventory, may get insurance on their cars, but a lot of businesses don't get insurance for the possibility, and a lot of times the distinct possibility, their business may be closed down for a while. So they're going to have to continue to pay the mortgage or the lease or the rent and maybe some salaries during this time where they don't even have the ability to make income. So that type of insurance is very important to also have. There should be plans in place. In a franchise business, perhaps less, even though this what may happen depending on the type of franchise. If you have the ability to have multiple suppliers or vendors, if you only have one supplier and something happens to that supplier, then you are in a bad situation. That's an emergency. That's a contingency. So always have backup suppliers and vendors in place. In this day and age of the internet, it's important to have a communication plan in place. How do you reach out to your customers, to your vendors, to your employees if something should happen to your business? What do you do in the case of an emergency? For example, something not of your own doing. Let's say there was a recall on hamburger meat and you have a hamburger franchise. Well, you didn't cause the problem, but your franchise is going to be stained with the concept that something's wrong with you. How do you deal with that type of situation? So you should have some press release, some PR ideas in mind. And since the franchise is really the core of it, is having standard operating procedures in place, having that cookbook, it's not that difficult to take the time and to start writing these things down, even if it's just a simple checklist or a bullet item. This is what I'm going to do. This is what, and over time, you can refine it as you have some time. It's obviously not going to be the first thing that you're going to do when you start or open a franchise. But who knows, maybe that second day after you've opened the doors, something happens. So I wouldn't delay it too much. There are employee issues. Any franchise that starts to hire people, you've got to be ready for emergency employee issues. A key employee may leave. Let's say you've got a franchise and you've got 10, 15 people working for you, and you've got a general manager. You know, you're a hands-off franchise owner. You've got a general manager running this one while you're looking at the bigger picture. What happens if that person leaves? Well, that's a contingent emergency you should be ready for. Obviously, there are lots of other things that emergencies that can come up. You can have an emergency in your family that will take you away from your franchise. What do you do in that case? So these are things that can be scary because it's a gigantic picture of, oh my gosh, look at all these problems I have to think about. I'm not saying that you should be frightened in your boots, but it's something that a good business owner, and this is the differentiation between a successful business and a non-successful business. The business owners are thinking of the bigger picture as well as the nuts and bolts of a business. They are the ones that are entrusted with making sure that the business as a business runs, and less so about the nuts and bolts and making sure the electricity gets turned on and off every single day.
Well, and I really like what you said about with suppliers and vendors, because there's really two important points there with respect to franchise owners. That obviously the franchisor is going to have either recommended or required suppliers or vendors, depending on the state, depending on the system and whatnot. But it's always good locally to do a comparison. Not only to see sort of what benefits you're getting by going through the suppliers or vendors, but like you said, you don't know what's going to happen. And to me, it's awfully easy to search locally and at least, go grab a coffee or place a phone call, do something to just identify to that supplier or vendor that you are there in the case that you might need them. And I just think that's a really important point, and I think in my experience it's often overlooked because people assume that because the franchisor works with this particular supplier that they don't have to worry about any of that. And I think that when people get into franchising too, or when people get into business, people always are wondering what's the right time to get out. And I'm curious your thoughts on that in terms of not only, every business is different. You can't pinpoint the exact time. But how do you properly plan for exiting a business?
Well, that's probably around 300 hours of podcast conversations, but I will try to distill it down into a couple of quick sentences. Okay. Every business has a business cycle. There is no business that is going to continue to last forever based on an existing business model. Nobody's going to live forever. So obviously, we all are going to exit at some point our businesses. As far as I know, we're not taking them with us to whatever happens next. So exiting is a eventuality. Now, exiting is, in the case of a franchise owner, is generally through a sale. Other businesses, there are other ways to exit, and even a franchise can exit in a different way. It can be done by giving it to a family member, or you can exit by selling this or part of it to a key employee, and you retain a smaller equity portion of the business. So there are ways to exit differently in a franchise. But the most important thing is to start with who you are and your objectives. Why? Why are you in business? It's a question that I ask myself at the beginning of every year. Every business owner, franchise owner himself herself should always ask, why am I in business? Is this meeting my personal life objectives? Is the business meeting the business objectives? If the answer is no, then you need to start questioning or finding out why the answer is no. So start with what your objectives, why, and what you want to do. Who are you? Understand that every business goes through a maturity. It goes through that business cycle. You don't want to exit when it's in decline. That's the best time to leave a business is when it's growing. Now, a business can have different growth spurts. Obviously, you've got the beginning growth spurt, but you want to be able to exit your franchise when it is, and this is something that you and I have talked a little bit about, and it's something that I'll be expanding a lot more on, the Don't Get Stuck in Your Business as well as Build Business Muscle. I also have a couple of ebooks that will be published in a little bit on Amazon where we talk about this. But a franchise owner probably doesn't want to hold on to the franchise to the point where his area is already at 100% saturation, because the person that's going to take over doesn't have a lot of growth potential. So you got to leave a little bit on that table, on that plate for the next guy. Something that is not intuitively, it's not something that we think of intuitively. We sort of think, oh, we want to squeeze every single drop out of that sponge. But for a franchise, that may not be the best way to exit.
No, that's a great point. And it goes back, like you said, to the beginning, right? I mean, you have to know before you buy your franchise, are you looking to be an individual owner of one? Is your strategy to become a multi-unit owner? Are you looking to develop a whole area? I mean, these are all questions that don't just come down to, how much money you have or whether you like the particular business. I mean, there's some real analysis that goes into, and some strategy, obviously, that goes into these kinds of decisions that you really need to think about at the start before you put down the money into the franchise. And obviously, you have a tremendous amount of experience with this and successful experience with that. So I am definitely looking forward to your ebook and more discussions about that through your podcast. And I'd love for you, if you'd like to before we part, to tell a bit more about your podcast and sort of what you do with those and what the objective is, and then tell us where you can be found and how people can best get a hold of you.
Okay, great. Well, my first podcast that I started around a year and a half ago, it's called Don't Get Stuck in Your Business. It's at don'tgetstuck.net. You can also, it's also don'tgetstuckinyourbusiness.com, which will forward to don'tgetstuck.net. That's a podcast that originally started with discussions and information about not getting stuck in your business in terms of not being able to exit it. And over time, it started to move in other directions where it's more, don't get stuck in your business with different things. People get stuck in their business with accounts payable, with too much inventory, with supply chain problems, with emergency contingency planning. Those are all things that people do get stuck in their business. So and that's really the emphasis of the Don't Get Stuck in Your Business podcast. There's a lot of overlap between that and the new podcast, which is Build Business Muscle, which is not about exit planning at all, even though exit planning is obviously a business muscle, but it's about a business core. And think of it about going to the gym. And a physical fitness trainer is always going to tell you that it's all about your core. Well, a strong business, whether it be a franchise business, a franchisor, a franchisee, a small business, a multi-billion-dollar business, it's about their core. If their core processes are not strong, they're not going to have a strong, lasting business. They won't have a return on the investment that they need to get. There are lots of different business muscles, and some of them are things that we don't even think of as a business muscle. We talked a little bit about that earlier on the podcast. We talked about passion. Passion is a great business muscle. How many people have you seen not have passion in describing their work or their job? They've got pretty weak business muscle when it comes to that. So we can be found at buildbusinessmuscle.com and don'tgetstuck.net. And the two business consulting companies that I have, i3 Marketing, which is really a very specialty marketing company because it's all about arts and craft materials. But if anybody wants a new arts and craft material for kids, they can always find me. But the main one that I do my consulting through is Big Picture Advisors, bigpictureadvisors.com. And all of these things together comprise for me a big picture of business.
Well, I think that's great, Joel, and I feel like I'd love to have you back on the show on a later date where we could, dive even deeper into some of those. What is your email? Do you prefer for people to email you or call you or?
They can email me at joel@bigpictureadvisors.com or joel@buildbusinessmuscle.com. But joel@bigpictureadvisors.com is probably the easiest way. Everything tends to funnel into that email.
Well, thank you again so much, and I certainly look forward to being in touch. And I know the audience is going to appreciate all your good advice, and hopefully we'll get in touch with you.
Well, thank you, Josh.
Thanks for being with us today on the Franchise Euphoria podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to go to iTunes and provide a review. Also, please remember that although Josh Brown is a licensed and practicing attorney, nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, because it is not. The information contained in this podcast is general and educational in nature, and none of it should be relied upon as legal advice. That being said, if you have questions for Josh and would like to contact him, please email him at josh@franchiseeuphoria.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you tune in to our next weekly episode.